Hello, I'm Mike Murray with the State Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. I work in the state's pesticide program, and I deal with certifying pesticide applicators, licensing businesses, and pesticide use. So today I'm going to talk about what it means to be following pesticide rules from the federal level, what the state pesticide rules are, and then also pesticide applicator certification, who needs that, what it means for you as an applicator, and then licensing of businesses and applicators, and then also some general thoughts about using pesticides, things that apply to everyone. Briefly touch on the worker protection standard, and also things you could consider about disposing of leftover pesticides. So to begin with, the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, they're the ones that establish the nationwide regulations for pesticides. They have a rule called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. Under that rule, EPA works with companies that develop pesticides, and they evaluate what those pesticide products are and where they can be used. And together with the business and EPA, they come up with registered products that can be sold and used to control a pest in this country. Now in Wisconsin, the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, also known as DATCP, we are the state lead agency for enforcing the federal EPA's pesticide rules, as well as state rules specific to use in Wisconsin. One thing to remember is that the federal government allows different state departments of agriculture to enforce their pesticide rules in their state. So each state might have slightly different regulations that you'll need to be aware of. So if you're working in Illinois or Minnesota, you'll need to talk to those Department of Agricultures in those states to be aware of their regulations. So in Wisconsin, we have a whole host of rules that are relevant to pesticide applicator certification. DATCP 29 is the primary rule that I'll be talking about today, but we have others as well listed on the bottom of the screen. So our rules are basically mimic a lot of what the federal regulations are. Protect people that are using pesticides, protect the environment, protect the food supply, and that's the goal of these rules and why they're on the books. So it covers a lot of different topics for using pesticides. It's not just applying them, but how they're stored, transported, handled, etc. In Wisconsin, we have over 12,000 different pesticides that are registered for use. Now, pesticide is a very broad term that covers a lot of different types of products, so herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, etc. The legal definition basically means that a pesticide is a type of product that's intended to kill, destroy, or repel some kind of organism or a pest. So it covers a lot of different things, and our rules apply to these products. So there are two main types of pesticides that we think about. There's what we call the general use pesticides, such as 7-SL, whose label is shown here, and that's a product that you can go to Farm and Fleet or a local retailer and anyone can purchase, take home, and use. And it's deemed that if you are following those labeled instructions, you should safely be able to use that with minimal risk to yourself and the environment. The second type of pesticides are the ones that the Environmental Protection Agency has determined to be restricted use pesticide. Now that's something that not anyone can go buy. To purchase and use restricted use pesticides, you need to be a certified pesticide applicator. And these products can only be sold to certified applicators. As you can see on this example label, there is a box right on the front that says restricted use pesticide that clearly identifies this type of product. So why would EPA make a product restricted use? Actually, there's a number of different reasons why a pesticide is considered restricted use or potentially more hazardous. Some of them could be more hazardous for the person using it. They might be toxic to humans. Others could be toxic to fish or wildlife or aquatic organisms. So the reasons why a product is restricted use can vary. It just means there's more hazard for using them, so you need to be trained and competent to use them properly. One thing that you should also keep in mind, just because a product is restricted use doesn't necessarily mean it's better for you to use. Each pesticide product, has a certain place and time and reason for using it, and it might not depend if it's restricted use or not. But it is something you'll need to be aware of. So in Wisconsin, if you're going to use a restricted use pesticide, you need to become a certified pesticide applicator. And so anyone who's mixing, loading, or applying these products must become certified. Now, a certified applicator cannot simply tell an uncertified person to apply a restricted use product. That would be a violation of our law. So everyone using restricted use pesticides must become certified. And that leads to the next topic of pesticide applicator certification. This is the process where we take, or someone who's going to become a pesticide applicator would study a little bit to learn some basics of pesticide use, get some knowledge, and it involves a university's pesticide applicator training program. They're the entity that develops training materials for applicators to purchase and study. The University of Wisconsin Extension also helps with training farmers and having training sessions in the counties with the ag agents. So private applicators can learn about pesticide use. So the university does the training, and at the Department of Agriculture, we do the testing of applicators. So to prove that you're competent after you're trained, you would need to come in and take a certification exam. Now, there's a number of types of pesticide applicators and different categories that we have in this state. The two main things to think about are private applicators and commercial applicators. So a private applicator is a person that is growing an agricultural commodity and they're using pesticides on property that they own or control. If you fit into that realm, you'd be considered a private applicator. Somebody who is using pesticides and contracting with other individuals or businesses to apply pesticides on their property, they are considered a commercial applicator. So those are the two general trains that you can go down of becoming certified. So the process to be certified is, the first thing is you need to purchase that University of Wisconsin Pesticide Applicator training manual to educate yourself on the right criteria about pesticide use. Now there's a number of different categories in Wisconsin. There's 20, and each different certification category covers different types of use. For example, on the slide here we have greenhouse and nursery. So people that work in those settings would certify under this category, whereas someone who's going to fly an aircraft and apply pesticides by air would certify in the aerial applicator category. So depending where you're using pesticides, you determine what training manual you would need to purchase. And then you purchase that and you study. And when you're ready, you would come into the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and you would take a certification exam with us if you're a commercial applicator. For private applicators, you would contact your county extension office, and they would be the ones who would offer the exam for you. Usually, for private applicators, that's at the end of a training session that you can attend. So, when you become certified, you take that test, you score over 70% on a 70-question multiple choice exam. Then you become certified, you're issued a certification card, and you have your credentials that identify you as a certified applicator. And then the doors open and you're able to purchase and use restricted use pesticides. We also license certain applicators in Wisconsin and businesses that contract for pesticide use. So our commercial applicators, the ones that are contracting for hire to make pesticide applications, they need to become certified to use pesticides, not just restricted use, but any type of pesticide. And those applicators, in addition to being certified for a 5-year time frame, must also obtain an individual license, which is valid for 1 year. And so if you think of certification as proving competency to use pesticides, the licensing is your legal ability to use it for that year. And then the businesses that employ them also have an annual license that they would need to obtain in order to contract for this type of work. So now let's talk about pesticide use. And these are different things that you're going to need to be aware of when you're using pesticides. Not just restricted use, but any type of pesticide. So the first thing that you need to consider is what pesticide should you use? I mentioned earlier we have over 12,000 that are registered in the state. And they're all registered for different uses by the Environmental Protection Agency. So you need to pick a pesticide that's going to match the type of pest you have and the crop or the setting where you're using it. We have a database where you can look up products that are registered in Wisconsin for use, and that's this screenshot here. Also, products might have different labels if they're being sold in different states. So we really want to make sure that when you purchase a product, you look at the label on that product, and that's the directions you follow. We do have some special labels for use in Wisconsin. For example, in the ginseng crops, we have labels that are specially designated through our department for use on ginseng. So there may be a supplemental label as well. And those are things that you'd be able to get from your pesticide dealer. Pesticide labels do have a lot of terms and sometimes it's complicated things on there. So if English is not your first language, one thing we recommend is, get someone who can read the label and help you understand it. You can contact our department, your chemical vendors may help as well, and make sure you know what the requirements are on the label so that you'll be able to use them. So you know that you have the right safety equipment, the application equipment that'll work with that product, etc. As always, you got to read the label first. So you should read it before you buy it to make sure that you have the right product that's in your hand before you purchase it. And then before you use it, read that label again to make sure you know you're using it properly. So, as I mentioned, you want to make sure that you have a pesticide that's going to work for the pest that you have. For example, these pests that you see on the tomato plant there, certain pesticides may be labeled for controlling these insects, and some may not. And then the ones that are labeled for the insect, they might only control it during a certain life stage of that insect. For example, if it's a grub, you can control it in the grub stage, but once the insect metamorphosizes to a different life cycle, that pesticide product may not work. So make sure you figure that stuff out before you make your application. Another thing that you'll need to do is look at the label and determine what kind of personal protective equipment that you need to wear when using these pesticides. Different types of products have different requirements for the safety gear. Typically it's long sleeve shirts, shoes, socks, and gloves. Some of them might have more that's needed, some might have other requirements as well. So when you are mixing and loading pesticides, typically that's the most hazardous part of using a pesticide. Often it's because we're using concentrated ingredients and you have to mix them and dilute them to different ratios. So it's important to make sure that you're using the right kind of coveralls and goggles and things like that. But equally important is make sure that you're following the directions for mixing the product accurately. You're measuring the amounts correctly for what you're going to use. And generally you should try to only mix the amount of pesticide that you need for that specific application. And that will help with reducing the amount of leftover product that you have and potential disposal issues related to that. So when you're mixing and loading pesticides, we do have a number of rules that specify where you should do that. In general, you need to stay away from surface water and you should not be right next to a wellhead when you're doing this. If you mix in the field, select a location that's safe to do so. And if you have a facility where you're normally mixing and loading, or it's a place on your farm, depending on the amounts that you have, you may need to consider building a mixing and loading pad to protect the water supply. After you use a pesticide, you might have some that is left over in your application equipment or in the containers that they were sold to you in. The best thing you can do is make sure that you keep leftover pesticides in the container where they were originally from. That way you'll be certain to know what is in that container. As you can tell in this slide here, there are different types of products that look like what your pesticide might be, and you really don't want to screw that up and cause an incident there with someone confusing what was in this container or your application equipment if you leave a load inside of that. So, when you store your pesticides, it's up to you to make sure that you store them in a secure manner. And that could be simply putting them in a cabinet, locking them in your workshop, or different areas where they're not going to be disturbed by children or animals won't get in there and cause problems as well. When you transport pesticides, use common sense to make sure that you can get that product from one location to the other, either from your farm shop to the field or wherever you're going to use this product. So make sure that the pesticide is in your vehicle securely, that it's not going to spill or fall out of your truck or be punctured by something jostling around in the back of your pickup truck bed. And you should always try to have the correct personal protective equipment with you and a spill kit in case there is an accident or a spill and you need to clean up some pesticide. When you make your pesticide application, do it at the right time. Make sure it's not too windy, the weather is appropriate, you're targeting the pest when it's in the right growth cycle or life stage, and that the conditions are good for doing a nice, precise application. You might have pollinators on site if you're a type of grower, or the neighbors might. Other people's adjacent property has things on there that they don't want impacted from your pesticide spray. And all these kind of non-target organisms should really be avoided. It's up to you as the applicator to make sure that pesticide you apply goes onto the target site and stays there. We don't want to see people inadvertently impacting off-target organisms. Our state does also have specific rules for the use of atrazine, which is a corn herbicide. We have restrictions that go beyond the rates on the label and timing restrictions as well. You can find maps of atrazine prohibition areas in the state where you cannot use atrazine. That's on the department's website, along with what these restrictions are. So check that out if you're growing corn, including sweet corn. When you're done making a pesticide application, the state rules actually require you to make a record of that application whenever you are using a restricted use pesticide. Those records would have to be kept for 2 years, and for atrazine for 3 years. Now, if you're a commercial applicator, you need to keep a record of every pesticide that you contract for. So those records would need to be kept for 2 years as well. We have example fact sheets of what these required elements are on a record, and basically they're recording what you did, the product, the target site, the pest, how much you're applying, etc. When you're done with your pesticide application, eventually you'll need to clean that equipment. So this is a practice you should just build into your routine so that when you're cleaning out your spray tank, you don't have any carryover or residues in that tank that might go from the previous pesticide application to the next one you're going to make. For example, if you're applying a product that kills all the weeds on a property and all the grass, and then you switch to a more selective herbicide as the next batch you're going to apply, you don't want any of that non-selective herbicide to be in the container and go into the next batch. So our department, as I said, we enforce the pesticide rules here in Wisconsin, and that includes making sure that people are using pesticides properly, they're following label directions, and our rules as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about compliance with pesticide rules and some of the violations that we typically see. So in this first example, there's someone in the field there and they're applying a pesticide, but they're not wearing the right safety gear. They don't have gloves or long sleeves on, and it looks like they're not wearing boots as well. So this would actually be a violation of our pesticide rules, and we would probably give the person a warning notice or verbally tell them for certain that they would need to wear this gear. if you're using pesticides, you really should wear that safety gear because it's important to protect yourself. And here's a poison control hotline number, which I think you should keep with yourself when you're using pesticides, should you need to call someone. And below that, there's an example label. And that's up there because labels always have what safety gear you should wear, your personal protective equipment, and they also might have material that would be useful for you to tell a physician should you call someone and need medical assistance. Post-application precautions are other things that you will find on pesticide labels, and these are types of information that whoever goes to that treated site after the pesticide was applied should be aware of. For example, staying out of the area until the pesticide is dry. This is something we see that is not always delivered to the customer or people don't record. And there's important information that needs to be known, especially by growers, because some of these post-application precautions are things such as harvest intervals or time frames that you cannot harvest a crop after a pesticide was applied. So if that would happen, it would get harvested earlier, not only is that a violation, it would be something that you have a crop now with exceeding a tolerance and cannot be sold into the food supply. So that could be a big deal if you cannot get your income from your crop. Drift is one of our violations that we see very often. People call us, and it can happen when a pesticide is applied to a target site, but then it moves off the target site. For example, wind would blow the pesticide spray from one side of the road across the road, and then damage on that site across the road is there from whatever was applied. So drift is not a good thing. It's a violation we take seriously. We investigate complaints of it. We would take samples to determine what happened. And ultimately, it's going to come down to you and your neighbor being upset that you killed something on your neighbor's property or impacted it. And that's not good for your neighbor relations either. So stay on target. That's very important. If you have a pesticide spill, those need to be reported to the State Department of Natural Resources. They have an 800 number you can call. Tell them you had a spill. They'll give you some advice about reporting and clean up and what you need to do. The last thing I want to talk about here is worker protection standard. So this is a federal rule that is developed by the Environmental Protection Agency, and like other pesticide rules, gets implemented by the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. So this rule here is basically intended to protect individuals that are working on farms and are going to be exposed to pesticide or areas that have been treated by pesticide. So if you have workers, you're going to need to follow this rule. And if you don't have workers, keep watching because there's general pesticide safety information that may be relevant to your operation just to keep your family members safe from pesticides. So in the WPS rule, an agricultural worker is someone who is not a family member, and they are people that are working in areas doing hand labor, so picking crops, pruning, etc., or they're considered a handler, someone that might actually be applying a pesticide. On each pesticide label that's for an agricultural crop, there should be a part of the label called the Agricultural Use Requirement Statement. And that identifies specific things you would need to do when using that product in a situation where a farm has workers or handlers employed. So look for that on the labels when you're getting ready to use them. So in general, the WPS standard involves sharing information with your workers. So there's a safety poster that people have been using and very commonly done in agriculture now. And that's something that provides specific information required by EPA. And it's put in a location where the workers and handlers can go see that and figure out where applications have been made and what was applied. So here's an example of what one farm did, where they had mapped out their fields and they'd put a listing of the different fields and what kind of applications of pesticides were made within a certain time frame. And this could be posted in a break room, and people can look at that and figure out if they're going to an area that was treated, they would then know that they should stay out for a certain time frame. So the safety training of your workers and handlers. New this year for the worker protection standard is that the handlers and workers need to be trained every year. So that's different than in the past, and that's due to a revision to the worker protection standard that went into effect last year. So the people who can train workers are someone who has taken a qualified training program by EPA, or they are a certified pesticide applicator. So there are certain entry restrictions that workers and handlers need to be aware of, and this could be something as a restricted entry interval. Many products, when they're applied, will have requirements that no one can enter the treated area for a certain number of hours or days. And that information needs to be conveyed to workers so they're aware of these restrictions. This can be done in a number of ways. Here's a picture of a logbook showing different pesticide products, what their active ingredients are, and what the restricted entry interval is. So you might want to develop something like this for your operation. Warning signs do need to be placed on fields or treated areas where there is a restricted entry interval, and this is an example of the required worker protection warning sign. The application exclusion zone is based on the type of equipment you're using. So an aircraft versus a tractor versus a backpack sprayer will have different exclusion zone requirements. Part of what you need to have on your operation is decontamination supplies. And these would be things for workers and handlers so that should they be exposed to pesticide, they would be able to clean themselves off. So think of single-use towelettes, soap, water, and having that available for them where they need it. There are certain distance requirements you would need to be aware of for where this decontamination equipment is kept. And in the slide is an example of a mobile unit where there's a porta potty, and then there's also what looks like a porta potty, but it's not functioning as a toilet. It basically has a place to change and clean, and that's where they're keeping their equipment. And there's water as well. So you could develop a mobile unit or have something in your shop if your fields are close enough. Emergency assistance is something you would need to provide should someone get exposed to a pesticide. This could be making sure people know who to call if they need to call someone other than 911. So have that information available and make sure your workers know about it. The last section I have is about pesticide disposal and getting rid of some of those containers and old pesticides that ultimately might accumulate in your operation. One thing that you should be doing with all your containers is triple rinsing them so that after the pesticide is out, you fill it with water, you swish it around, and then you empty that rinsate. And if you do that 3 times, then that container will be deemed clean and you can recycle it or send it to the landfill. The rinsate water from each time you rinse that, the best thing to do is put that into your application equipment and use it for your next batch or apply it to a site that's approved on the label for that pesticide product. Another good idea is to cut the containers or puncture them in some way so that that container does not get used for something beyond what it was intended to. The containers should be disposed of and not reused for other purposes. If you do actually have some leftover product of a type of pesticide, many counties run what we call a clean sweep program. And those are places where you can take your old pesticides and dispose of them, and then the county will take that product to an approved landfill or disposal site. So look that up. Our department website has listings of where they happen in the state, and that could be a resource for you as well. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.